And so to the Hebrew calendar, it's more. They might call it something like, let's see, so something like a 6:34 in the evening, or something along those lines, because they measure time differently, because God goes by evening and morning days and stuff. So they wouldn't go by like Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And so, because they measure days differently, because the biblical evening, 6 p.m. Okay, 6 a.m. is the beginning of a new day on God's timeline. 6 p.m. is the beginning of a new biblical day, the 24-hour day. Okay, and when you connect that to God's timeline, and in God's time, and prophetically, we're talking 6 p.m. on day 6 of God's timeline, which would have been 1749. Yeah, so basic math. So, anyways, we are at 12:33 on the 7th day of God's timeline. Okay, because we can type in, because the Hebrew calendar is missing 240 years. 5783 should say 6023. So when you multiply, when you divide 41 2/3 by 60, and then multiply that by 33, you would get something that might begin with 23, or maybe 22 with a decimal point and some nines after that. What I did was I put 22.12 and got 23 even. And we're probably a little bit past that, to be honest, on God's timeline, but not much. Okay, we will be at 12:34 in the morning on the 7th day of God's timeline, probably somewhere around the end of May, somewhere around that area, 7 months after Rosh Hashanah. So yeah, this is about where we was at Rosh Hashanah, the Hebrew New Year. Okay, and keep in mind, the 7,000 year timeline says that Jesus should have came back at Rosh Hashanah if the Hebrew year is 6,000, which coincided with the Gregorian calendar year of 1999, according to the missing 240 years on the Hebrew calendar. So, in the fall of 1999, they coincide with the Hebrew year 5760, Rosh Hashanah, which should have said 6,000 even. Okay, and that right there should have been around the time Jesus should have came back, according to the 6,000 year timeline. Here we are at 6,023, and as you can see, Jesus still isn't back yet. So really, we should have realized that something was overlooked back then. We should have realized we overlooked something back then. So, So 1,000 divided by 24 times 6, that is 250. And then 1,000 times 6 is 6,000, so we have 6,000 of that. That brings you to 6,250. Okay, so 6,250 equates to 6 a.m. on the 7th day of God's timeline. on the Hebrew calendar, which equates to the Gregorian calendar year 2249. And since there's a 12-hour period between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m., and 12 hours equates to 500 years, we take 2249, subtract 500 years, and that gives you 1749. Yeah. So that brings you 1749. That is how we know this. Scripture-based data. This mathematics is based on the 1,000-year day. Okay? Psalm chapter 9 verse 4, 2 Peter 3 and 8. Okay, the whole, the 500 year and all that stuff. And then the idea that Jesus is coming back after 6 a.m. on the 7th day of God's timeline, which equates to the Hebrew year, well, the actual Hebrew year, 6,250. The Hebrew calendar is going to say 6,010 in the year that Jesus comes back. And which will coincide with the Gregorian calendar year, 2249. So, all of this is based on Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, Exodus chapter 20, 9 through 11, Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16, the parable of the workers in the vineyard, Mark chapter 15, 25 and 33, basically want to get proof that, some biblical proof that 6 a.m. is the biblical, it's when the biblical daytime begins. The biblical daytime begins at 6 a.m. That's what that's for. And then Psalms chapter 90 verse 4 and 2 Peter 3 and 8. All of this is based on that right there. Those 6 verses of scripture right there. Okay, and if you really want to go deeper, Genesis chapter 1, where it talks about the evening and morning days. God goes by evening and morning days. Notice something. Each time God did something, in Genesis chapter 1, all throughout it, Genesis chapter 1, it says, and the evening and the morning was the first day. Evening and the morning was the second day, and so on and so on, to the 6th day. Okay? So, the 6 days of, and Exodus chapter 20, 9 through 11, that is not talking about 6 24-hour daytimes, like, okay, because the biblical 24-hour day begins at what we would call 6 p.m. Okay? And that interpretation of 6 p.m., as I said, would mean that Jesus should have came back in 1799, which, excuse me, not 1799, 1749, I mean. Sorry. Okay, so I think the 99 part came in and in the way that we interpret the day, to us, the biblical day begins at midnight. So, and in God's timeline, midnight equates to Rosh Hashanah, the new millennium. The Hebrew New Year, new millennium, which I guess they call their new year Rosh Hashanah. So, Rosh Hashanah of the new millennium. And the Hebrew new millennium, according to the missing 240 years on the Hebrew calendar, the Hebrew new millennium was in the fall of 1999. So you take 1999, you add 250, and that's how we know that the Gregorian calendar year 2249 would coincide with the Hebrew year 6250. Now the Hebrew calendar is off by 240 years, and it's actually going to say 6010, but the actual year would be 6250. That's going to be the actual year. Okay? Now we're talking the return of Jesus. So, I mentioned at some point that we still have 227 years until the second coming. Using scripture-based data, and I already gave you the scripture that this data is based on, since we know that Jesus is coming back in the Hebrew year 6250, that the Hebrew calendar is missing 240 years, and that the Hebrew calendar year should actually say 6023 instead of 5783. So you would subtract 6023 from 6250, and that would take you to 227. Okay, add 2022. That would take you to 229 minus 227. That would take you to 2022. That is how we know that we have 227 years until the second coming. Regardless of what you believe about the rapture, that also means that we have 220 years until the Antichrist emerges. Which means that the Antichrist has not even been born yet. Well, the man that would become the Antichrist has not even been born yet. In fact, his grandfather hasn't even been born yet. So, yeah. So, that is how we know. That is how we know that Jesus is coming back in 227 more years. Yeah. Because of the biblical workday. Didn't take me as long as I thought. But that's good. The biblical workday is how we know that Jesus is coming back in 227 years. We still have 227 years. Now, when Jesus says that he's coming soon, well, he is. That's roughly 5.5 hours, his time. I mean, Jesus says he's coming soon. Well, technically, let's see, it's about 12. It's barely 12:34. We are between 12:33 and 12:34, so we're looking at about 5 hours and 27 minutes, somewhere around that time frame. Until and Jesus' timeline until he returns. And also, here is something that's free. Since the biblical daytime begins at 6 a.m., it is reasonable to assume that Jesus rose from the dead on the first day of the week at 6 a.m. It is reason. I think that's very reasonable to assume that. Now, because Scripture doesn't mention the exact time, and we know that it had to have been early in the morning. We don't know how long it took them to get ready to go in, and we don't know how long it took them. Was it all three Marys or something? Wasn't all three of them named Mary? But there was three Marys in the Bible, wasn't there? Anyways, we don't know how long it took them to get ready. They said they went up early in the morning. So, how early are we talking? Did they just miss Jesus by a few minutes? Well, they probably would have had to have got up and don't know how long. It probably took them a little bit to get ready, to get dressed and everything. So Jesus rose from the dead at 6 a.m. on the first day of the week. And they probably got there maybe 10, 15 minutes later. And I'm just guessing at that. Then, they would have already seen it. So, yeah, that is a theory that I have. I can't prove that, but that is a theory, that Jesus rose from the dead at 6 a.m. on the first day of the week. I can't actually prove that, so don't quote me on it. But everything else I said in this video about the biblical workday, that is biblical. And I just proved it. Everything I said in this video is 100% based on what I just said. It's based on the biblical workday. Okay? It is not a... God's timeline is not a 7,000 year timeline. It's a 7,250 year timeline. It's missing 6 hours. It should be 6 hours longer. Or 250 years longer. Yeah, God's timeline should be 250 years longer than what it is. It's not a 7,000 year timeline. That's not biblical. Because, the scripture I just gave, it's a 7,250 year timeline. Because the parable of... One second, let me get that up here again. The parable of the workers in the vineyard and Mark chapter 15 verses 25 and 33, they clearly demonstrate that 6 a.m. If you do the math, that they don't explicitly say that that the biblical daytime begins at 6 a.m., but they give us enough information that we can do the math and we arrive at that conclusion ourselves with basic math. When we acknowledge, especially the King James, King James and New King James, any translation that refers to 3 p.m. as the 9th hour, 11 p.m. as the 11th hour, 12 o'clock noon as the 6th hour, 9 o'clock a.m. as the 3rd hour. So, subtract however the amount of hours, and you get 6 a.m. And on God's timeline, 6 a.m. equates to 250 years after the new millennium. So 250 years after midnight is Rosh Hashanah, the new millennium. Okay, when Rosh Hashanah hits the new millennium, the Hebrew new millennium, which it did 23 years ago, okay, on the 7th day, which it did 23 years ago, then we had 250 years after the Rosh Hashanah of the Hebrew 7th millennium, which began, the 7th millennium began 23 years ago. And the Rosh Hashanah of the Greek in the Rosh Hashanah of the Gregorian, okay, Rosh Hashanah of 5760 should have been the Hebrew year 6000. And it coincides with the Gregorian calendar year 1999. Okay? So, that was 12 a.m., midnight. So 6 a.m., which is 250 years later, would be 2249 on the Gregorian calendar. The Hebrew calendar is going to say 6010, but it should say 6250. Okay? The numbers 22 and 49 coincide, and the numbers 62 and 50 coincide with biblical prophecy. I mean, they have prophetic meanings, basically. For instance, there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. The number 49 and 62 are part of Daniel's 70-week prophecy. Okay? Daniel has a prophecy that has regarding three timelines.